federal agents pour through my own front door, and I just stood there in the middle of my kitchen, hands steady, chin up, eyes dry, while my son dropped to his knees on the floor right in front of me, sobbing, begging, saying, "Mom, please, please just tell them to stop." And I didn't move. I looked at him, really looked at him, maybe for the first time in years. And I said, quietly, almost gently, "You chose this, baby. Not me. Not your father. You." And then the cuffs clicked. And his wife, this woman who had sat across from me at Thanksgiving tables and birthday dinners and had smiled that smile, that practiced, pretty, poisonous smile, was screaming at the agents like she still had power in my kitchen. In my house. She didn't. Not anymore. 6 weeks before that night, I was just a 67-year-old widow sitting alone in a diner booth on a Thursday afternoon, trying to get through another week without my husband, watching the Tennessee sky go gray outside the window, wondering why my coffee had gone cold so fast. I had no idea my son was already planning to strip everything from me. I had no idea my husband had died trying to protect me from him. And I had absolutely no idea that the land I had lived on for over 4 decades, the land I had planted and walked and grieved and prayed on, was sitting on top of a secret that people were willing to kill to keep buried. 6 weeks before those agents showed up in my kitchen, all of that was still underground. Literally. My name is Dorothy Hayes, and I have lived on the same 200 acres of land in rural Tennessee for 41 years. I moved onto this property as a 26-year-old bride, nervous and excited and completely in love, and I never left. My husband Gerald and I built everything here, not just the house, not just the farm, but an entire life. We raised a son on this land. We buried a dog on this land. We had our worst fights and our best mornings on this land. And when Gerald died 14 months ago, a car accident, they told me, a tragic, terrible accident on a rain-slicked country road, I stayed. Because leaving felt like dying twice, and I wasn't ready for that. I want you to understand what kind of woman I am before I tell you the rest of this story, because I think it matters. I am not a dramatic person. I am not someone who sees shadows in corners or suspects the worst in people. I spent 41 years trusting my husband completely, raising my son with everything I had, welcoming a daughter-in-law into my family with open arms. I am the kind of woman who brings casseroles to neighbors and remembers birthdays and sits with people in hospital waiting rooms because nobody should have to do that alone. I say this not to pat myself on the back but because I need you to understand how completely blindsided I was by what came next. Because women like me, women who love hard and trust easy and give generously, we are exactly the kind of women that certain people look at and see opportunity. I had been going to Patty's Diner every Thursday afternoon since Gerald died. It was my thing, my one small act of self-preservation in those early months of grief. Patty's sat right at the edge of our town, tucked between a tire shop and an empty lot, with vinyl booths the color of old mustard and coffee that was never quite right but always hot. The owner, a heavy-set woman named Brenda, never once asked me how I was doing, and God bless her for that, because I could not have answered that question honestly without falling apart on a Thursday afternoon in a public place. That particular Thursday, my son Caleb and his wife Renee had driven out to join me. Caleb had his father's jaw and his father's eyes, but, and I only understand this now, none of his father's character. Renee was polished in that way that always made me feel slightly underdressed, with her highlighted hair and her manicured hands wrapped around a mug of green tea she never actually drank. They sat across from me in that booth, and I remember thinking how nice it was that they came, how much it meant to me that my son still showed up. I was so desperate for family in those months that I mistook presents for love. That was my first mistake. Renee spoke first, in that voice she had, light, careful, rehearsed, like she'd practiced in the car on the way over. "Dorothy, we've been talking, and we really think you need to consider downsizing." She tilted her head the way people do when they want to look concerned without actually feeling it and said, "That land is just too much responsibility for one person at your age." And Caleb nodded, immediately, automatically, like a man who had already agreed to everything before he walked through the door. "We just worry about you, Mom. The taxes, the upkeep. Winter's coming again." I smiled my polite smile, the one I had been perfecting for 14 months. I have lived on that land for 41 years, I told them. I know how to take care of it. Renee and Caleb exchanged a look right then, quick, practiced, the kind of look that passes between two people who have had a conversation you were not invited to. Mothers notice those looks. We always do. It was the look that said not today, but soon. They excused themselves to pay the bill, and I sat there gathering my purse, folding my napkin, telling myself I was imagining things. I wasn't. Because that was the moment she appeared. She came out of nowhere, a woman in her early 50s, iron gray hair pulled tight, wearing a coat that was way too heavy for indoors, with eyes that didn't wander or blink. They locked right onto mine like she had been looking for me specifically, like she had walked into that diner with one single purpose. She said my name, Dorothy Hayes, not as a question, as a statement, as a fact she already knew. And before I could even respond, she slid a thin manila envelope onto the table, pressed her finger against it for just a second. And I noticed her hand was trembling slightly, and then she leaned in close and whispered, "You're going to need this tonight. Whatever you do, don't open it here." I opened my mouth to ask who she was, how she knew my name, what any of this meant, but she was already gone. By the time I stood up, she had slipped out the door and disappeared into the parking lot like she'd never existed. I stood there frozen, staring at that envelope like it might bite me, and then Caleb and Renee came back from the register, and I shoved it into my purse before either of them could see it. My hands were already shaking. The drive back to the farm was 20 minutes of small talk about property values and winter weather and whether I had scheduled my flu shot yet, and I sat in the back seat of my son's car nodding and answering and performing normalcy while that envelope sat in my bag like a live wire. They dropped me at the end of my gravel driveway, declined my invitation to come in. They always declined lately, I realized, and I stood there watching their taillights disappear down the road, and I felt, for the first time since Gerald died, genuinely watched. Like the tree-line was paying attention to me. Like the land itself was holding its breath. Now I need to back up for a second, because I don't want you to walk away from this thinking Caleb was always this person. He wasn't. Or maybe he was, and I just loved him too much to see it clearly. He was a good kid, curious, funny, a little sensitive in the way that boys who grow up close to their mothers sometimes are. Gerald was harder on him than I was, which caused friction between them as Caleb got older, and when Caleb brought Renee home 6 years ago, something shifted. Renee was ambitious in a way that our family simply wasn't. She had grown up in Nashville, had a career in real estate, and had very clear ideas about what a successful life was supposed to look like, and a Tennessee farmhouse with aging in-laws attached to it was not part of that picture. I watched her work on Caleb quietly over those 6 years. Subtly redirecting his priorities. Slowly increasing the distance between him and his father. Gently, consistently, expertly reframing Gerald and me as a burden rather than a family. I didn't have a name for what she was doing back then. I do now. But I'll get to that. What I can tell you is that by the time Gerald died, Caleb had already changed in ways I kept making excuses for. He stopped calling as often. He started every conversation about the farm with a problem, the roof cost, the equipment age, the property tax increases, like he was building a case I didn't know I was being tried in. And Renee, God, Renee had this way of speaking to me that was so nice on the surface that you couldn't call it out without sounding crazy. "We just want what's best for you, Dorothy. You've been through so much, Dorothy. Sometimes grief makes it hard to think clearly, Dorothy." Every sentence was a compliment wrapped around an insult, concern wrapped around control. That is a skill, by the way. A learned, practiced, deliberate skill. And the truly terrifying thing about people who use it well is that they can make you doubt your own perception of reality while they're doing it. I sat across from my son and his wife in that diner booth and walked away questioning myself. That is exactly what they wanted. That is exactly what people like Renee count on, that the woman across from them is too gracious, too loving, too eager to keep the peace to trust what her own gut is screaming at her. My gut was screaming. I just hadn't learned to listen to it yet. But that envelope in my purse was about to teach me. I didn't open it right away. I want you to know that, because I think it says something about where my head was that night. I walked into my house, locked the door behind me, something I had only started doing after Gerald died, set that envelope on the kitchen table, and sat across from it like it was a person I wasn't sure I trusted. The house creaked around me the way old houses do in the wind, and outside the Tennessee dark came in thick and quiet, and I just sat there. I made myself a cup of chamomile tea I didn't drink. I watched the clock on the microwave change numbers. I was stalling, and I knew I was stalling, because some part of me understood that whatever was inside that envelope was going to cost me something. Peace of mind, at minimum. Maybe more. At exactly 8:47, I slid my finger under the flap. Inside was a brass key wrapped in tissue paper, old, heavy, worn smooth at the head the way things get when they've been handled for years, and a single strip of lined notebook paper folded once. The handwriting was neat, deliberate, the kind of handwriting that belongs to someone who was taught to take their time. It said, 11:32 p.m. Answer. Do not call back. That was it. No name. No explanation. No context. Just a time, an instruction, and the implication that my phone was going to ring in exactly 2 hours and 41 minutes and that I had better pick up. I checked the call log on my phone, nothing from an unknown number, nothing unusual. I checked the envelope again for anything I'd missed, nothing. I turned the key over in my palm for a long time, trying to imagine what it opened. It wasn't a house key or a car key. It was older than that, heavier, the kind of key that opens something that was built to stay locked for a long time. I locked every window in the house. I turned off the porch light. I sat back down at the kitchen table and I waited, and I want to tell you that I was calm, but I was not calm. My heart was doing something irregular and my thoughts kept circling back to Caleb and Renee's faces in that diner booth, to that look they exchanged, to Renee's voice saying that land is too much responsibility for one person at your age, and something about all of it was starting to connect in a way I didn't have words for yet. At 11:31, I turned off every light in the house except the one above the kitchen sink. The yellow glow made the corners feel farther away than they were. I put my phone face up on the table in front of me and I watched the clock tick over to 11:32, and the moment it did, my phone rang, and the sound cut through that house so sharp and sudden that I knocked my chair back just flinching from it. No name. No number. I answered on the second ring because my hand moved before my brain could tell it not to. At first there was just breathing. Slow, controlled, close to the microphone. And then a voice came through, low, distorted, filtered through something electronic, and I swear to you, I swear on everything I have left, my knees went weak before my brain even fully registered why. Because underneath the distortion, underneath whatever they had run it through to disguise it, I knew that voice. I had known that voice for over 40 years. I had heard it in my kitchen and in my fields and in hospital waiting rooms and in the dark of our bedroom when one of us couldn't sleep. I had heard it say my name 10,000 times. Eleanor, it said, and yes, Gerald always called me Eleanor when he was being serious, even though everyone else called me Dorothy. Do not trust Caleb. Do not trust Renee. And do not trust the local police. I pressed my hand over my mouth to keep from making a sound I couldn't take back. You are not safe where you are, the voice continued. The land is the reason they want it empty. I was shaking so hard the phone rattled against my ear. Who is this? I whispered. This isn't funny. Who is this? There was a pause, a breath, and then. I wish I could tell you everything. I wish I could explain all of it, but if I stay on too long they'll find me. What happened to me was not an accident. And if you let them push you off that land, they will erase everything I left behind for you. The line crackled violently. The voice cut out, then came back for one final sentence, clear and close and devastating. The truth is under your feet, Dorothy. And you don't have much time. And then the line went dead. I sat there with the phone pressed against my ear long after the screen went dark, just sitting in the yellow kitchen light, not moving, not crying, not doing anything. Then I checked my call log. Nothing. No record of the call. No unknown number, no missed call, no duration, nothing, like it had been erased the second it ended, like it had never happened at all. But my hands were shaking and my chest ached in a way that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with terror. I did not sleep that night. I sat at that kitchen table until the sun came up, watching the light creep across my floor, and I knew, with the kind of certainty that lives in your body rather than your brain, that whatever had killed my husband was still alive. And it was closer to me than I had ever allowed myself to imagine. Caleb showed up the next morning without calling first. He never used to do that. When Gerald was alive, Caleb always called ahead, out of habit, out of respect, maybe out of a small and healthy fear of his father's disappointment. But Gerald was gone now, and apparently so were Caleb's manners. He pulled into my driveway just after 8 in the morning like a man who had already decided the place was his, carrying 2 coffees and wearing that tight, careful smile I had started to recognize as the one he put on when he was about to say something he'd rehearsed. "Morning, Mom," he said, setting a cup in front of me. "You look tired." I told him I hadn't slept well and left it at that. He sat across from me and let his eyes move around my kitchen the way a person's eyes move around a room they're calculating, and they lingered, just a half second too long, on the door to Gerald's old office. "We need to talk," he said. And then he said the word. Guardianship. Not right away, he built up to it, the way people do when they know what they're about to say is going to land hard. First it was, "We're worried about you, Mom." Then it was, "The property taxes are climbing and the insurance is a nightmare." Then it was, "If something happened out here, no one would even know for hours," and the word something sat in the air between us like a threat wearing a costume. "An accident," he said when I pushed him. "A fall. A medical episode." And the word accident hit me somewhere deep and specific because it was the same word they had used about Gerald. A tragic accident on a rain-slicked road. I kept my face completely neutral. I had learned to do that in the last 14 months without even realizing I was learning it. Renee arrived an hour later, also unannounced, and she didn't even sit down. She stood near my kitchen doorway scrolling through her phone like she was already late for something more important, and then she looked up and told me, not asked me, that she had reviewed my financial accounts. Just to understand where things stand. I felt something hot move through my chest. "You had no right to do that," I said. She smiled that smile. As Caleb's wife, and given the circumstances, we felt it was our responsibility. I looked at my son. He didn't meet my eyes. Renee continued, "The savings rate was unsustainable, the property maintenance was excessive, grief was clearly affecting my judgment, and every sentence was delivered in that soft, reasonable, deeply condescending tone that is specifically designed to make you feel like the crazy one for being upset by it. And then she said it, if you agree to sell the property and move closer to town, all of this goes away." I asked her what happens if I don't. She stepped closer, lowered her voice, and said, "And I need you to really hear this, farms are dangerous places, Dorothy. People your age get hurt all the time. It would be such a tragedy if something happened before this was all resolved." I stood up so fast my chair scraped back across the tile, and I told them both to get out of my house. Caleb looked genuinely shocked, like he had not prepared for the possibility that I would say no loudly. Renee didn't flinch. She just picked up her bag and walked out with the calm of a woman who has a plan B already in motion. I locked the door behind them and stood in my kitchen with my back against the wall and my heart slamming against my ribs, and I understood something with total, cold clarity. They were not worried about me. They were afraid of what I was standing on. And whatever was buried beneath this land had turned my own son into someone capable of threatening his 67-year-old mother in her own kitchen while holding a coffee cup he'd brought as a prop. I didn't cry. I cleaned. I washed both coffee cups. I wiped the table. I swept the floor. And when there was nothing left to clean, I stood in the middle of my kitchen and made a decision. I walked down the hall, opened the door to Gerald's office, and went inside for the first time since he died. The room still smelled like him, cedar and machine oil and just the faintest trace of the Irish Spring soap he'd used for as long as I'd known him. His desk sat exactly where he'd left it. His reading glasses were still folded on top of a stack of papers he'd never finished reading. I had avoided this room for 14 months because grief lived in here, and I wasn't sure I could survive it. But standing there in that doorway, I understood that something else lived in here too. And it was time to find it. I started with the filing cabinet. Property tax statements, insurance policies, equipment manuals, everything looked ordinary until I forced myself to slow down and look the way Gerald always looked, carefully, methodically, like every detail mattered because details always do. That's when I noticed the dates. Several documents had been recently repositioned, not removed, not hidden, just shifted, the way a person arranges things when they want them to be found by the right person at the right time. Behind the deed paperwork I found a thin folder I had never seen before. Inside were bank statements, cash withdrawals, spaced carefully across 8 months, always just under the amount that triggers automatic bank reporting, always ending exactly 2 weeks before Gerald died. My chest tightened so hard I had to sit down. Gerald hated cash. He believed in paper trails and receipts and documentation. He used to say if you can't prove it happened, it didn't happen. If he was withdrawing cash like this, quietly, carefully, under the radar, it was because he was paying for something he didn't want anyone to trace back to him. Or to me. I kept digging. At the very bottom of the drawer, folded inside an old equipment warranty, I found a piece of yellow legal paper with my name written across the top in Gerald's handwriting. Dorothy, if you're reading this, I couldn't stop it the way I hoped. Don't ask questions where ears are listening. The truth is buried, and keeping you in the dark was the only thing keeping you alive. I had to set it down. I had to press both palms flat on the desk and just breathe for a minute, because the room was spinning and my husband was dead and he had known. He had known something was coming and he had faced it alone and he had spent his last months trying to build a wall around me with silence. I moved to his computer next. It took me 4 tries to get the password right. Our anniversary didn't work, the dog's name didn't work, his mother's maiden name didn't work, and then I tried the address of the first piece of land he ever bought, the little plot in Dixon County he'd owned before we even met, and the screen unlocked. Inside were archived emails, not deleted, archived, which matters, because deleting means you want something gone and archiving means you want it kept, correspondence with a criminal defense attorney based in Atlanta. Short, careful messages. Meeting confirmations. Payment receipts. No details, nothing explicit, just the outline of a man quietly building a legal safety net around himself. And photographs, night shots of the far edge of our property, tire tracks in soft earth after rain, equipment I didn't recognize parked near the tree line at the base of the old slope. The part of our land Gerald had told me, for years, not to walk alone after dark. He always said the terrain was uneven down there. That it was easy to turn an ankle in the dark. I had believed him completely, the way you believe someone you love completely, the way you stop questioning the things that are explained to you by a person whose judgment you trust. He hadn't been protecting me from an uneven slope. He had been protecting me from what was happening at the bottom of it. And he had done it alone, in the dark, for God knows how long, because he loved me and because he knew that if I found out, I would not stay quiet, and staying quiet was the only thing keeping me alive. My husband had walked straight into danger so I wouldn't have to. And it had killed him. And now that danger was mine. I didn't go outside for the rest of that day. I watched the land through my windows instead, the tree line, the old slope behind the north field, the stretch of ground Gerald had always steered me away from. Just after sunset, a truck I didn't recognize rolled slowly past my driveway. Didn't stop, didn't turn in. Just crawled past and disappeared. And then an hour later, it came back. Same truck. Same slow crawl. I stood back from the window so I wouldn't be visible, and I felt something I had never felt in 41 years on this land. I felt like prey. My phone rang just as the last light left the sky. No distortion this time, just a man's voice, quiet and controlled. If you're alone, don't hang up. He told me his name was Grant Mercer, and that he was someone Gerald had trusted when he ran out of other options. He told me Gerald had started noticing things about 2 years before he died, fresh tire tracks after rain, equipment moved overnight, lights near the tree line at hours when nobody should be there. He followed it all the way underground, to a service tunnel running beneath my property that had been expanded over the years into a network of rock chambers nobody had ever officially mapped. Caleb had found the tunnel access years before Gerald did and had recognized immediately what it could be used for: illegal shipments, storage, transfers, using our land, our family name, our isolation as cover. Gerald confronted Caleb directly when he figured it out, father to son, giving the boy every chance to walk away. Caleb promised he would. Gerald believed him, because Gerald was the kind of man who believed love was stronger than greed. He was wrong. His car didn't go off that road on its own, Dorothy, Grant said. It was forced. I was following that night. I couldn't get there in time. I didn't say anything for a long moment. There was nothing to say. They're moving faster now, Grant continued. Once that land changes hands and construction starts, the tunnel disappears forever. That truck outside your house tonight, it wasn't lost. The call ended and I sat on my kitchen floor in the dark, pressing my palms flat against the cold tile, feeling the ground beneath me like I was trying to understand what it was hiding. The knock came just after midnight. 3 slow, deliberate taps, not urgent, not frantic, the kind of knock that is designed to sound calm because the person doing it knows they have backup. I was sitting at the kitchen table in the dark, no lights on, listening to the refrigerator hum and the wind move through the old oak trees out back, when I heard it. I didn't move. And then Caleb's voice came through the door. Mom. It's me. We need to talk. And then a second voice, professional, measured, practiced in the specific tone of someone who has learned how to make authority sound like concern. Mrs. Hayes, this is Deputy Collins. Just here to check on you and make sure everything's okay. The local police. The exact ones I had been told explicitly not to trust. I moved to the window beside the door without turning on any lights, staying low, staying back from the glass. 2 vehicles in my driveway, Caleb's truck and a patrol car with its lights off. And there was Renee, standing at the edge of my porch with her arms folded and her posture completely rigid, not performing concern, not even trying anymore. Just waiting, like a woman who has already signed the paperwork and is simply annoyed that the last detail hasn't been handled yet. I cracked the door just enough to speak. Caleb stepped forward immediately. Mom, you haven't been answering calls. Renee says you've been saying things that don't make sense. We're really worried. Renee didn't bother denying what she'd told them. She just looked at me with that faint, practiced smile and said, Dorothy, please don't make this harder than it needs to be. You've been through so much trauma. Sometimes people genuinely don't realize when they need help. Deputy Collins cleared his throat and said they'd received a welfare report and would like to come inside and just talk. I knew exactly what this was. This was not a wellness check. This was removal, the move they had been building toward for months, maybe longer, executed now because they were out of patience and out of time. And something happened in me right then that I still struggle to describe. Every soft thing went hard. Every uncertain thing went completely clear. I felt something steady move through my chest, and I said no. Quietly. Firmly. Without a single word of explanation. And then I slammed the door and locked it. The shouting started immediately, Caleb pounding, Renee's voice going sharp and cold, Deputy Collins announcing he had authority to enter if he believed I was a danger to myself. And I ran. I grabbed my coat off the mudroom hook and Gerald's old flashlight from the shelf above it and I went out the back door into the freezing Tennessee night without looking back once. The cold hit my lungs like ice water and the ground was hard as concrete under my feet, but I ran across my own yard and through the gate and into the tree line, and behind me I heard the front door go, they'd forced it, and flashlight beams started cutting through the dark between the trees. I heard Caleb shout, Mom, stop. You don't understand what you're doing. And I thought, baby, I understand exactly what I'm doing. For the first time in a very long time. I ran to the clearing near the old slope and dropped to my knees beside the flat rock Gerald had always pointed to on our Sunday walks, the one he'd wink at and say that's where I'd hide something worth keeping. He was never joking. I dug with my bare hands in frozen ground, nails breaking, fingers splitting, palms bleeding, until I hit something solid. A sealed waterproof container, heavy, built to survive underground for years. I wrenched it free, stood up, and ran. A flashlight beam caught my face just as I cleared the trees and I saw Caleb for one clear second. Not my son, not grief, just panic and something almost feral. "Give it to me," he screamed. I turned and ran harder. Past the far tree line I saw headlights on the old service road, a car idling, passenger door already pushed open, and a woman's voice cutting through the dark, "Get in, now." I didn't hesitate. In the rear window I watched Caleb stumble to a stop at the edge of the woods, his flashlight falling from his hand. He had made every one of his choices. And tonight, finally, so had I. And right here is where I want to pause for just a second, because if you're new to this channel, what we do here is real. These are real stories, collected from Reddit, Quora, and other forums, shared with consent, with names and details changed to protect privacy, and then broken down psychologically so we can all learn something from them. Because understanding why people like Renee and Caleb do what they do is the first step to making sure they never do it to you. If that sounds like something you need in your life, hit subscribe right now. Dorothy's story isn't over yet, and neither is the psychological breakdown of everything that just happened. Here's what I need you to understand about people like Renee and Caleb, and I'm saying this with the kind of quiet, bone-deep rage that only comes from having lived it. What they did to Dorothy wasn't random. It was a system. Psychologists call it coercive control, a pattern of manipulation, financial pressure, and psychological tactics designed to strip someone of their autonomy without ever leaving a visible mark. And it works so devastatingly well on women like Dorothy because it weaponizes their greatest strengths. Her love for her son became a blindfold. Her grief became an open wound they pressed on deliberately. Her generosity became the door they walked through. Renee is what psychologists call a high-functioning manipulator. She never yelled. She wrapped every threat inside the language of concern. "We just worry about you, grief is affecting your judgment," which is a technique called concern trolling, and research published in the Journal of Elder Abuse and Neglect shows it is used deliberately to make the target doubt their own perception of reality. That self-doubt is not a side effect. It is the entire point. And Caleb's role was equally calculated, the passive enabler, someone whose silence and compliance gives the abuse legitimacy and whose borrowed love makes it land deeper. Renee was never pretending to love Dorothy. Caleb was. And that is its own specific, devastating cruelty. Then there's the guardianship threat, which the National Institute on Aging has flagged as one of the fastest growing forms of elder financial exploitation in this country. The playbook is always identical: manufacture evidence of instability, isolate the target, create financial urgency, present guardianship as the loving solution. Dorothy was one signature away from losing the legal right to her own life, not because she was incapable, but because two people who needed her incapable had decided to build a case for it. That is not family. That is predation in a cardigan. And the only reason it didn't work is because Dorothy did the one thing they never accounted for. She listened to her gut. The woman driving was named Claire Donovan, and she told me she had worked with Gerald off the record during the last year of his life. She pulled into the lot of a closed roadside motel, cut the engine, and told me to open the container. Inside were flash drives sealed in plastic, a small notebook wrapped in oilcloth, and a letter in Gerald's handwriting with my name across the top. I opened the letter first. "My dearest Dorothy, if you're holding this, I couldn't stop them. I'm so sorry. But you were always stronger than you believed." I had to press my hand over my mouth to keep from completely falling apart right there in that passenger seat. Claire gave me a moment, then quietly told me everything on those drives: the tunnel access points, the transfer records, the payment trails, Caleb and Renee's direct involvement, documented and time-stamped across 2 years. Gerald had built a federal case from scratch, alone, in secret, while sleeping next to me every night and never letting me see the weight of it. The man had protected me with his silence and then handed me his sword on the way out. Now we needed to use it. The plan was straightforward because there was no time for complicated. I sent a message from my own phone: "I'll return what I took. Come to the house tonight. Come alone." We both knew they wouldn't come alone. But they would come, because they had no choice. That container was the only thing standing between them and everything they'd built, and they knew it. Claire made 3 calls while I sat in that passenger seat reading Gerald's letter a second time, and by morning, people were in position. That evening I stood in my kitchen again, one light on, the container sitting on the table in plain view like bait. My heart was pounding but my hands were steady, and when the knock came I opened the door myself. Caleb entered first, pale, eyes darting everywhere. Renee followed, expression unreadable, controlled to the last. And then Deputy Collins stepped in behind them and pulled the door shut, and the 3 of them standing in my kitchen told me everything I needed to know about how deep this went. Renee looked at the container and then looked at me and said, "You have no idea what you've done." And I looked at my son, really looked at him, and said, "You killed your father." Caleb shook his head violently. It was supposed to scare him. Just scare him enough to make him stop. And Renee's eyes flashed cold and she said, "He was a liability. That's all." That was all Claire needed. The lights snapped on, doors burst open, federal agents flooded every entrance with weapons drawn, and the room went from quiet to chaos in about 4 seconds flat. Renee screamed. The deputy froze. And Caleb, my son, the boy I raised on that land, dropped to his knees on my kitchen floor, and looked up at me with tears streaming down his face, and said, "Mom, please." I looked at him for a long moment. And then I said, quietly, "You chose this. Not me. Not your father. You." And the cuffs clicked. The weeks after moved with a strange, exhausting intensity, statements, attorneys, federal investigators walking my land with maps and equipment. The tunnels were sealed and documented. Caleb was charged. Renee received a longer list of charges than either of them had anticipated. The deputy resigned before his indictment was finalized. I didn't attend the first hearing. I wasn't ready to see my son behind glass. Instead I walked the land. I walked the fields at sunrise and stood at the edge of the tree line listening to birds return to places that had felt watched for too long. I dug my hands into the garden soil and let the earth remind me that not everything buried is meant to stay hidden. Gerald's attorney contacted me with confirmation of a trust Gerald had established quietly months before his death, enough to maintain the property, enough to protect me from ever being forced out, enough to let me choose my future without fear. He had prepared for the worst outcome while hoping for a better one, and he had done it all without ever making me carry it. I visited Caleb once, months later. He couldn't look at me at first. When he finally did, there was no anger left in his face, just regret, the hollow kind that lives in people who understand too late what they've thrown away. I didn't forgive him that day. But I told him the truth. Your father loved you until the very end. And because of that love, he trusted me with what Caleb could not be trusted with. I left the prison and I didn't look back. The land is still here. So am I. And that is Dorothy's story. On this channel, every story you hear is real, collected from Reddit, Quora, and other forums, shared with full consent, with names and identifying details changed to protect privacy, and a little fiction added to fill the gaps. We break them down psychologically because understanding the mechanics of manipulation is the only real protection against it. If this story hits something in you, if it made you feel seen or validated or just a little less alone in whatever you're navigating, hit subscribe, because there is a lot more where this came from. And if you want to keep watching right now, there's another story waiting for you on screen. You're not going to want to miss it.